Hi, and welcome to the final screencast for this term's e-commerce course. I'm just going to briefly go over what to expect on the final exam, and I'll also talk about sort of the end results of the project. One thing you'll want to do before you study for the final exam, or part of your studying for the final exam, is make sure you've read through the Rails overview notes on the Learn site. These notes, if you haven't taken a peek at them, contain a lot of the sort of crucial details that you may need during your exam for quick reference. So you could find all this stuff on the Rails guides or looking at the Ruby API, but a lot of the information is just presented here. And so if you look at what's available in these notes, of course, our sort of diagram of the MVC sort of flow, how to create a new Rails app, scaffolding, generating a controller, generating a model, migrations, setting the route, partials, images, working with model forms, and things like building, and this will be actually quite important for the final exam, select drop-downs with form tag, model forms with associations. Keyword search just points into the various locations of our keyword search that we implemented with the simple store example in class, session, and before filters. This particular side here, this single user HTTP authentication, you might find it interesting. It's how to do just a username password authentication for specific controller actions. It's not examinable material, however. And then the last few slides have to do with debugging Rails, which you might want to read over as well. Okay, for the final exam, if you look into the extra reading materials section of the course content, you'll find a document called Final Exam Review, and it's just a point form document that specifies what you need to know for the final exam. I'm not going to read this over for you, but you can see it's broken down into the sections of model, views, and controller. Notice this one is highlighted. And there's also a section on routes and just this general knowledge section. To practice for your final exam, or even to focus your studying, there is a final challenge. This challenge doesn't need to be submitted to the Dropbox. It's just for you to work on as a sort of a practice exam. And like the practice exam for the midterm, what this should allow you to do is to figure out where you need to focus your studying, and also where you need to focus your sort of documentation researching skills. Like when you find yourself having to look something up while doing this challenge, you have to know which resource to go to and where within that resource to find the required information. And so that should be a clue that you may have to do that on the exam as well. So in this challenge, you're building a simple Rails application for sort of storing, searching, and sorting information about countries. So initially you build a scaffold of a country model which has a name, population, median age, life expectancy, GDP, and a Boolean value for mandatory minimum service. And there's some sort of extra setup where you go and modify pieces of this scaffold. You then have to build a non-scaffolded controller, which you will use to build a number of views that pull out sort of filtered portions of country data for you. There's a search section where you have to add searching by keywords like you did in your store. And then there's a more advanced search where beside your search text area or text input, you will have a drop-down. Because we're searching through countries, you'll have a drop-down that either allows you to choose searching through all countries, searching through countries of mandatory military service, or searching through countries without mandatory minimum service. So there's some information on how to do this in the notes, specifically how to set up a drop-down. But then you'll also have to work with the controller action, the search controller action, to be able to take what has been submitted by the user from this drop-down, pull it out of the params hash, and then modify your search accordingly. There's a section on navigation, sort of building a menu that's present on all screens. And lastly, there's some work with session. So you'll have to be using the session superglobal to carry out this last portion of the practice exam. So I would actually start studying by first, as I said, reading through the Rails overview notes and then diving right into this practice exam. And as you do it, anytime you struggle with something, anytime you find yourself going to the documentation, make a quick note of that. When you're done the challenge, you'll be left with a list of things that you needed assistance on, which are all things that you should be studying for your final exam. The final exam is open book in that all of our course content is available. So you can go to any material in the course notes section or the extra reading material section. You can also reference the Ruby API, ensuring that you're using it for the correct version of Ruby as specified in the URL. Rails guides are also considered to be open book, and they too, you have to, unless you're using Rails 4, you'll have to specify the Ruby version in the URL. And so those are our main resources. The other resources you'll get access to will be any of the code examples that I've put up on my GitHub repository throughout the term. And so you might want to sort of familiarize yourself with where those particular resources are located, because they're in amongst sort of all of the repositories that are in my particular GitHub account. But those things like the simple store, the single user Twitter, the non-scaffolded Rails intro app, those kind of things are available to you. Now, what isn't available to you during your exam will be any of your coursework. So it's not open previous assignments, it's not open ultimate challenges. Although if I have developed the challenge code, so for example, the single user Twitter, that is available to you. And Google at large should be considered off limits. Not necessarily because using Google is a bad thing when coding. It's just that with the resources that you have, like the API and the Rails guides and our course notes, they should all contain the information sort of filtered down for what you need for the exam. If you're searching Google at large, you're going to have to be sorting through lots of Rails information that is for older versions and stuff that doesn't quite fit the situation at hand. Okay, a few other things I wanted to mention. One was the final project. So we're now done our work on the final project. I thought it went really, really well. You can see that the combined average across the two sections was 86% and a combined median of 80, which is incredible. The standard deviation is a bit larger than I usually like to see in my assessments. I try to aim for a standard deviation of 15 or lower. The reason why it's probably larger for this particular project is that we have marks that go beyond 100. So the sort of the drift around or the spread around the average has more opportunity to grow when we have this many marks available. And so thank you all for your hard work on this project. One thing to note is that I'm aware that term 3 is a very sort of work-intensive term, and so I do appreciate the fact that you all spent time on this project. I also appreciate the fact that you went with sort of a non-standard project like this, and hopefully you enjoyed it. I've been running this, I think this is my third or fourth time running this style of project in the course, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback from it. I'll be sending out a short survey after exams where you'll also be able to give me some feedback on the term and on this project specifically. I'd like to congratulate the winners of the prizes that I've set up for the course. I've contacted the website Pluralsight, which has thousands of screencasts on all sorts of different topics, IT-related topics, so programming topics or IT setup topics. You can see all the courses they have available. They have a number of Ruby and Rails screencasts as well, and so they've offered to send me some free subscriptions, some free month-long subscriptions to their site. Those are in the mail, so they will be arriving probably sometime in the new year, and they'll be going to the top 2 from each section. So in section 1, that's Gannon and Dan, and in section 2, it's Brett and Eric. So congratulations to all 4 of you. Beyond that, there's just a few things I'd like to mention about Rails and Ruby in general. If you enjoyed these languages and these frameworks during this course, and you want to continue learning about them on your own, there's a few resources I'm going to point you to. One is the book Eloquent Ruby, which is one of the best programming books I think I've ever read, and it really shows you the eloquence of the Ruby language. And it's written by a guy named Russ Olson. I've read a few of his other books; they're all great, but this is the real best of them. And you can get it, of course, as both an ebook or a Dead Tree version. I'm currently in the middle of reading this book here by Sandy Metz, and it's called Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. This one could be a really good pairing for taking the ideas from your OO class and merging them with the Ruby programming language. This is, as it said, practical OO. So it's object orientation taught in direct context of a programming language, and specifically Ruby. And it's really an amazing book, and it's making me sort of rethink some of my ideas, and maybe even making me relearn some of what I earlier thought I knew about object orientation. So very, very cool book. If you want extra Rails practice, and this is sort of after the course is done, this Ruby on Rails tutorial is quite amazing. It's free online, although you can also order it as an ebook or a physical book as well. And it has two versions. You can sort of view the Rails 3.2 version and as well as the Rails 4.0 version. So if you wanted to get up to speed on Rails 4.0, you could go through this tutorial. It starts from very basics, and it includes Git as well. The one really great part of this tutorial is that it's done in a test-driven way. So you use RSpec, which is a testing library for Ruby, to build up tests for your Rails projects, for your models, etc. And you build those tests first, and then you code until the tests pass. So it's quite an interesting way of running a tutorial. Another book that I found to be really interesting, it's also available for free online, is this Objects on Rails, and it sort of turns Rails on its head, and it's not a style of Rails programming that I've ever seen in the wild, but it's a really interesting look at sort of applying the full spectrum of object-oriented techniques to the Rails framework. The last thing that I'm going to mention for the day is that there's a code retreat coming up in December. It's happening on December 14th, which is next Saturday, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So it's a full day thing. It's happening at Skullspace. And basically, it's a day where a bunch of programmers get together and try to code up what is called the Game of Life. Game of Life, which is Conway's Game of Life. It's this two-dimensional world where cells within the world are either black or white, and based on their neighbors, these cells will either live, die, or reproduce. And it's built on some very specific rules. You can write a computer program that implements Conway's Game of Life. And so what they're doing for the code retreat is people are going to get together, they're going to pair program, they're going to do test-driven development in any language of their choice, and try to build various versions of the Game of Life. Very interesting idea. This is like code retreats are happening all over the world on this day. I can't attend this year, but I know a few students are already planning to attend, sort of present and past students, so you might want to check this out as well. You do need to register, so you have to go to this website, which is the coderetreat.org website, and find the Winnipeg page for the Winnipeg event, and then you need to sign up from there. Okay, that's all I have to say right now. Once again, thank you for coming to all of our classes, listening to the screencasts, and learning Ruby on Rails with me. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you liked the project. I hope it gave you a little bit of a snapshot of contract development and some of the sort of positives and negatives of being forced to sort of assess a large project and build it piecewise while making sort of decisions as to which pieces should be and should not be included. So yeah, I had a lot of fun teaching the class, and I will see you at your exam.